Someone you love was cremated, and ever since that day, you've been carrying a question you're afraid to say out loud, because Our Lady of Mount Carmel made a promise to those who wear her scapular. She promised to descend into purgatory herself and bring them out with her own hands. But your loved one no longer has a body, no chest to hang that blessed cloth from. And July 16th is almost here, the feast of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, the day when that promise burns brighter than any other day of the year. So you ask yourself, and it hurts to ask, does that promise reach someone who was reduced to ashes? Does Mary go that far? Or did cremation shut that door forever? Saint Teresa of Jesus lived inside the Carmelite order. She reformed it from its very foundation. She knew that promise the way you know the walls of your own home, because she slept under it, prayed under it, built entire convents under it. And what Teresa understood about souls who no longer have a body and the protection of Our Lady of Mount Carmel changes everything you feel when you think about that family member who was cremated. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. If you've ever wondered whether the promise of Our Lady of Mount Carmel reaches your departed loved one who was cremated, write in the comments, Our Lady of Mount Carmel, cover my departed loved one with your mantle. Write it now. Because what comes next was kept for those who carry that wound. And what Saint Teresa of Jesus discovered within the oldest tradition of Carmel needs you to receive it whole, without skipping a thing. July 16th has been burning in the Church's calendar for centuries. It burns because on that day, the Blessed Virgin Mary revealed a promise that no other Marian devotion has ever matched. It was the year 1251. A Carmelite friar named Simon Stock had spent weeks begging the Mother of God to protect his religious order, which was going through a crisis so deep that many believed it was finished. And Mary answered. She appeared surrounded by angels, holding in her hands a brown cloth scapular, and she spoke words that have haunted millions of Catholics for nearly 800 years. Whoever dies wearing this scapular shall not suffer eternal fire. And she added something else, something many people repeat, but very few truly grasp. She herself would descend into purgatory on the Saturday after the death of whoever wore her scapular, and she would bring them out with her own hands. That promise is known as the Sabbatine Privilege, and for centuries it worked in a way nobody questioned, because Catholics died and were buried with their scapular on. The cloth went with them into the coffin. It touched their skin as the body was lowered into the ground. Mary's sign stayed on the chest of the deceased like a visible, tangible, real seal. The body would decompose, yes, but the scapular was there. A physical bond existed between the promise and the person, until cremation came along. In 1963, the Catholic Church lifted its ban on cremation. Catholics could choose to be cremated without committing a sin, as long as they didn't do it for reasons that contradicted the faith. It was a necessary pastoral change for millions of families. But at the same time, that change cracked open a wound in the popular understanding of the Carmelite promise. Because if the body vanishes in the fire of cremation, what happens to the scapular that covered it? Does the bond vanish too? Is the promise broken? This question has an answer, and it's been hiding for centuries inside Carmelite theology, inside the deepest tradition of the order that Saint Teresa of Jesus reformed with her own hands. But before we get to that answer, you need to understand something that most Catholics get wrong. The promise of Our Lady of Mount Carmel never depended on the cloth. Never. The cloth scapular is a sacramental sign, a visible object that represents an invisible reality. Just as the water of baptism represents the grace that cleanses the soul, the scapular represents the consecration of the soul to Mary. And the consecration of the soul does not burn. The consecration of the soul is not reduced to ashes. Saint Teresa of Jesus understood this with a clarity that takes your breath away when you read her writings from this angle. She lived inside Carmel. She wore the Carmelite habit every single day of her religious life, But when she wrote about the protection of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, she never reduced it to the cloth she was wearing. In the interior castle, when she describes the graces Mary gives to those who consecrate themselves to her, she speaks of the soul as a dwelling place, as an interior castle where the Virgin enters and remains. The cloth of the habit could wear out, tear, get lost. But the dwelling of the soul where Mary lived was indestructible. There is a condition, though, and this condition is something most families with a cremated loved one have no idea about. The promise of Our Lady of Mount Carmel has requirements. The scapular must have been imposed by a priest with the proper faculties. The person must have lived in a state of grace, or at least died in a state of grace after a valid confession. They must have prayed the prayers the Carmelite devotion requires, whether the daily rosary, the little office of the Blessed Virgin, or whatever prayer the priest specified at the time of investiture. And they must have observed chastity according to their state in life. When those requirements are met, the bond between the soul and Mary's promise is sealed at a level that human fire cannot touch. Cremation destroys the body, destroys the cloth, destroys everything the eyes can see. But there is something cremation cannot touch, and that is precisely what matters: the relationship between that soul and the Mother of God. Think about this. When a priest baptizes a baby, he pours water over the child's head. That water dries within minutes. It disappears. But the baptism remains forever in that person's soul, because the sacrament imprinted an indelible character that nothing can erase. The scapular of Mount Carmel works with a similar spiritual logic. The cloth can disappear, but the consecration that cloth represented remains alive in the soul, and Mary's promise is bound to that interior consecration. Saint Teresa of Jesus built her entire reform on this conviction. When she founded the first convent of Discalced Carmelites in 1562, she chose for her nuns a habit that was poorer, rougher, simpler than what the Calced Carmelites wore. She cared less about the quality of the fabric and more about the quality of the interior surrender. The outward habit was supposed to mirror the habit the soul wore on the inside. And that interior habit, the one Mary saw when she looked at her Carmelites, was the one that activated her protection. So the question that has been hurting you since the beginning of this message is starting to find an answer. But the full answer needs something more. It needs you to understand what happens on July 16th inside Purgatory, when the feast of Our Lady of Mount Carmel opens a door that stays shut the rest of the year. And it needs you to understand what role your prayer plays in all of this, because Mary's promise has one part that depends on her, and another part, the decisive one, that depends on you. Avila, 1562. The night is cold, and the convent of St. Joseph barely has walls. Saint Teresa of Jesus has been sleeping for months on a straw mattress, eating almost nothing, praying in a chapel that smells like fresh plaster. She has founded the first convent of Discalced Carmelites against the will of practically everyone. The bishop is suspicious. The Calced Carmelites look at her with resentment. The townspeople of Avila filed a lawsuit to shut the convent down before it even opened its doors. And she keeps going. Because what drives her to found this place is directly connected to the promise of Our Lady of Mount Carmel and to something she understood in a way that few people in her time could grasp. Saint Teresa of Jesus chose to reform the order of Mount Carmel. That means she took a religious order that had been operating a certain way for 300 years, with a certain habit, a certain rule, and she stripped it back to its hardest, poorest, most bare-bones origin. She changed the habit. She changed the rule. She changed the way they prayed, ate, slept, lived in community. Why? Because for her, the outside had to reflect the inside with radical honesty. If the soul stood naked before God, the body had to live with that same nakedness. If the soul wore Mary's mantle on the inside, the cloth on the outside had to be as simple as possible, because what mattered was the invisible mantle. And here is the key that connects to your question about cremation. When Saint Teresa of Jesus talked about the Carmelite habit, when she wrote about what it meant to wear the brown cloth of the order, she never treated it like a good luck charm. In chapter 38 of the book of her life, she tells how the Blessed Virgin Mary appeared to her and clothed her in a mantle of great whiteness and brilliance. But that mantle was made of something the eyes of the body could not see. Saint Teresa perceived it with the eyes of her soul, a mantle that covered her interior being and represented the purification Mary was working in her. What Our Lady of Mount Carmel placed on her that night was something no human fire could ever touch, because it was inside. That vision marked the rest of Saint Teresa's life. From that moment on, every time she invested a novice with the habit in one of her convents, she did it with a double awareness. She placed the cloth on the young woman's body, but she knew the cloth was only the reflection of something Mary was doing in that woman's soul. The real garment was invisible, and the promise of Our Lady of Mount Carmel clung to that invisible garment with a strength the outer cloth could never match. Now think about your departed loved one, the person you loved who was cremated. The fire destroyed their body. It destroyed whatever cloth they were wearing. But if that person was consecrated to Our Lady of Mount Carmel through the investiture of the Scapular, if they received that sacramental from the hands of a priest and lived with the devotion the promise requires, then Mary clothed them in something the crematorium fire never saw, because it operated in a dimension human fire cannot reach. Saint Teresa of Jesus wrote in the interior castle that the soul has interior rooms where God dwells, and that these rooms are inaccessible to any outside force. Whatever happens outside the castle, no matter how violent, cannot penetrate the interior mansions where the soul meets God and Mary. The fire of cremation happens outside the castle. It happens to the body, which is the outer wall. But the promise of Our Lady of Mount Carmel operates in the interior mansions, where Mary has direct access and where no element of the physical world can intervene. There is something else you need to know, and it involves a letter Saint Teresa of Jesus sent to her nuns at the convent in Seville in 1576. In that letter, written during one of the darkest, hardest moments of the Carmelite reform, when everything seemed to be falling apart from the outside, she reminds them that the protection of Our Lady of Mount Carmel does not depend on outward circumstances. The nuns in Seville were facing real persecution. Their convent property had been seized. They lived in constant fear that even the habit on their backs would be taken from them. And Saint Teresa wrote to tell them that even if the cloth were ripped from their bodies, even if they were left with nothing visible to identify them as Carmelites, no one could rip away the protection Mary had given them on the inside. That protection was sealed in the soul. And the soul, Saint Teresa of Avila said, belongs to God and to His Mother. What they seal, human hands do not open. This teaching resolves the anguish so many Catholic families carry when they've cremated a loved one. If your departed loved one received the scapular during their lifetime, if they lived in the faith and tried to be faithful to that devotion, if they died in God's grace, or at least with sincere repentance, then Our Lady of Mount Carmel clothed them in a mantle that the fire of the crematorium never touched. That mantle remains on their soul, and the promise remains active. But a piece is missing, because the promise of Our Lady of Mount Carmel has one specific day when it activates with special power. A day when Mary descends into purgatory with a force that stays veiled the rest of the year. That day is July 16th. And what happens on that day inside purgatory, what Saint Teresa of Jesus understood about liturgical feasts and their direct effect on the souls who wait there, is something your cremated departed loved one needs you to know before that date arrives. What does the Catholic Church actually say about cremation and the promise of Our Lady of Mount Carmel. Because one thing is what you feel in your heart, and another thing is what doctrine teaches. And many Catholic families live trapped between those two shores, not knowing which one to hold on to. The Church has spoken. It spoke clearly, even though most of the faithful have never read the document where it said it. In 2016, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith published an instruction called Ad Resurgendum cum Christo, which means to rise with Christ. That document established the Church's definitive norms on cremation. And what it says shifts the perspective for many families living in distress. The instruction confirms that the Church still prefers the burial of the body, because burial more directly respects the dignity of the body as a temple of the Holy Spirit and expresses faith in the resurrection of the flesh. But at the same time, it makes absolutely clear that cremation is not forbidden. A Catholic may be cremated without it affecting the salvation of their soul. The condition is that cremation must not be chosen for reasons contrary to the Christian faith, such as denying the resurrection of the body or viewing death as final annihilation. This is where the tension so many families feel comes in. Because if the Church allows cremation, why do so many Catholics still believe a cremated loved one falls outside Mary's protection? Where does that idea come from? Who put it there? The answer is painful but honest. That idea is born from confusing the sign with the reality the sign represents. The cloth scapular is the sign. The consecration of the soul to Mary is the reality. When people see the scapular burn in the crematorium along with the body, they assume the promise burns too. But Catholic theology teaches the exact opposite. Sacramentals, which is the category the scapular belongs to, work through the prayer of the Church and the interior disposition of the person who receives them. The cloth is the vehicle, but the grace travels in the soul, and the soul does not burn. The Catechism of the Catholic Church confirms this in paragraph 1671, where it explains that sacramentals prepare the faithful to receive grace and dispose them to cooperate with it. The interior disposition, the faith, the devotion, the free and conscious consecration of the soul to Our Lady of Mount Carmel, that is what activates the promise. The cloth was the visible door through which grace passed, but the grace already entered and stayed inside. What would Saint Teresa of Jesus have said about this? She never wrote about cremation because in her time it didn't exist as a Christian practice. But she wrote extensively about something that illuminates this question with overwhelming force. In the interior castle, Saint Teresa of Avila describes the soul as a castle with many rooms, and she says the innermost rooms are inaccessible to any outside enemy. Whatever is inside the castle, whatever God and Mary have placed at the center of the soul, remains untouched by anything that happens outside. Storms, attacks, fire, all of that strikes the outer walls, which are the body and material circumstances. But the center of the castle, where grace dwells, where Mary's presence dwells, remains at peace. Apply that image to cremation. The fire of the crematorium acts on the outer wall, the body. It destroys the cloth of the scapula that rested on the chest. It reduces the bones to ashes. But inside the interior castle, in the deepest mansion where Mary sealed her promise, everything remains intact. The consecration holds, the bond holds, and the promise of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, the promise that she will descend into purgatory to free those who wear her scapula, remains in force, because Mary looks at the soul. Mary sees the scapula that human fire cannot see. There's an objection some theologians have raised over the centuries, and it's only fair that you hear it. They argue that the Sabbatine Privilege was formulated in an era when cremation was forbidden by the Church, and that the promise was therefore made with buried bodies in mind, bodies wearing their scapular. That objection has historical logic, but it has a serious theological problem. It reduces Mary's promise to a material contract, as if the Mother of God had inserted fine print. as if Mary had said, "I'll protect you, but only if your body stays in one piece." That contradicts everything Catholic tradition teaches about the intercession of the Blessed Virgin, which is universal, generous, and driven by a maternal love that seeks to save, not to exclude. Saint Teresa of Jesus would have understood it this way. Her entire spirituality points in that direction. She reformed Carmel precisely to free religious life from outward formalities that was suffocating the soul's direct relationship with God and Mary. Everything she ever wrote shouts that the interior rules. That cloth without the soul is a rag. That ritual without faith is theater. That Mary's promise reaches wherever the faith of the soul opens the door. But something is still pending, something that's been open since the beginning and I haven't closed yet. Because knowing the promise is still active for a cremated soul is one thing. Knowing what happens on July 16th inside purgatory, when the feast of Our Lady of Mount Carmel turns promise into action, is something very different. What takes place on that specific day, according to the Carmelite tradition that Saint Teresa of Jesus knew from the inside, is something very few families with cremated departed loved ones have ever heard. And it will completely change how you live this July 16th that is almost here. Every year, when the calendar turns to July 16th, something happens in purgatory that the Carmelite tradition has guarded with reverence for centuries. The feast of Our Lady of Mount Carmel opens what mystical theologians call a window of grace, a moment when Mary's intercession reaches a power that stays contained the rest of the year. And the souls in purgatory know it. They feel it. They wait for that date with an intensity we, the living, can barely imagine. To understand what happens that day, you first need to understand how liturgical feasts relate to purgatory. The Church doesn't celebrate feasts the way you celebrate a birthday, just remembering something that happened. Liturgical feasts make present the grace of the mystery they commemorate. When the Church celebrates Christmas, the grace of the Incarnation pours over the faithful with renewed force. When it celebrates Easter, the grace of the resurrection acts with particular power. And when it celebrates the feast of Our Lady of Mount Carmel on July 16th, the grace of the Marian promise activates in a way that stays dormant the rest of the year. Saint Teresa of Jesus understood liturgical feasts with a depth that few in her era could match. In the book of her life, she tells how on certain feast days she received special graces, clearer visions, more precise interior locutions. Feasts were not mere reminders for her. They were doors that opened in heaven, and through those doors, torrents of grace poured down, reaching both the living and the dead. Saint Teresa of Jesus experienced the liturgical calendar as a living organism, where every feast was a heartbeat of the Church pumping grace toward every member of the mystical body, including those in purgatory. On July 16th, the feast of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, that heartbeat concentrates on the promise Mary made to the Carmelite order. And the Carmelite tradition, handed down from generation to generation inside the convents Saint Teresa of Jesus founded, teaches that on that day, Mary descends into purgatory with a specific mission: to free the souls that belong to her, the souls that were consecrated to her, the ones who wore her scapular, visible or invisible. And what about cremated souls? Here is where the Carmelite tradition gives an answer that very few have heard outside the walls of a convent. When Our Lady of Mount Carmel descends into purgatory, she does not look for bodies, she looks for souls. Mary does not check whether the body of the deceased is intact underground or reduced to ashes in an urn. Mary looks for the seal her scapular left on the soul. And if that seal is there, if the consecration was real, if the devotion was sincere, then that soul belongs to her. And what belongs to Mary, Mary claims. Saint Teresa of Avila wrote something in the 6th mansions of the interior castle that illuminates this reality with tremendous force. She describes how a soul that has been touched by God and by Mary carries within it a mark that no one can erase. She uses the image of a jewel kept inside a chest. Even if the chest is destroyed, the jewel remains intact. The body is the chest. The soul, with its consecration, is the jewel. Cremation destroys the chest, but the jewel Mary placed inside shines just as brightly as the day it was placed there. Now, there is something you need to understand about time in purgatory, because it directly affects what you can do for your cremated departed loved one this July 16th. Purgatory does not operate on the same time we know here on earth. Theologians teach that purifying suffering may be experienced as durations that don't correspond to our days and weeks. A soul may feel it has been in purification for years when only a few hours have passed here, and the reverse. What seems like a long wait here may pass differently in that dimension beyond our clocks. That is why liturgical dates matter so much for the departed, because when a feast like Our Lady of Mount Carmel brings an avalanche of concentrated grace, that grace can compress, accelerate, transform the purification process of a soul in a single instant. What was going to take months of purifying suffering can be resolved in one moment if Mary's grace intervenes with the particular force that July 16th gives her. Saint Teresa of Jesus had first-hand experience of this. In her writings, you can sense a woman who lived every feast day on the church calendar with her entire body and soul pulled taut. In chapter 38 of the book of her life, she describes how she saw souls leave purgatory at specific points in the liturgical calendar, seized upward toward heaven as if a hand were pulling them out of the fire with loving urgency. She identified Marian feasts as the moments of greatest liberation, and the feast of Mount Carmel, the feast of her own order, the feast of the mother who guarded her nuns with fierce tenderness, held a special place in that spiritual geography of time. Your cremated departed loved one is somewhere in that purgatory, and July 16th is almost here. What you do before that date, what you offer on that day, the way you activate Mary's promise with your prayer and your sacrifice, it can make the difference between your loved one continuing to wait or Mary taking them by the hand and carrying them into heaven. But there is a protocol. There are concrete steps the Carmelite tradition has preserved so that the faithful can actively work alongside Our Lady of Mount Carmel in the liberation of their departed. And those steps begin before July 16th. Listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you, because these are the concrete steps you can take before July 16th to activate the promise of Our Lady of Mount Carmel on behalf of your cremated departed loved one. This comes from the Carmelite tradition, from the spirituality Saint Teresa of Jesus lived and passed on to her nuns, and from the devotional practice the Order of Mount Carmel has safeguarded for generations. What you're receiving here is a spiritual protocol, step by step, so that this year's July 16th becomes the day Mary acts with her full power on the soul of your loved one. The first step begins 9 days before the feast, July 7th. That day, the novena to Our Lady of Mount Carmel begins, and that novena is the most powerful spiritual preparation you can offer for a cremated departed loved one. A novena is sustained prayer over 9 consecutive days without interruption, and its power lies in the constancy, in your daily faithfulness to that appointment with Mary. She sees your perseverance. She sees that you dedicated 9 straight days to pleading for the soul of someone you love, that you got up early or stayed up late or carved out time from wherever you could to keep that appointment. And that constancy moves her mother's heart in a way that a single prayer, however fervent, rarely does. Each day of the novena, pray 3 Hail Marys asking specifically for the soul of your cremated departed loved one. Name them. Say their name out loud. Pronounce it the way you used to when they were alive, with the same tone, the same familiarity. The souls in purgatory need someone to name them. They need someone on earth to speak their name before God, and before the Blessed Virgin. When you speak your loved one's name during the novena, you are building a bridge between your prayer and their soul. Mary hears that name and carries it with her when she descends into purgatory. After the 3 Hail Marys, pray a Hail Holy Queen. The Salve Regina is the Carmelite prayer above all others. When you say those words that have been echoing through the convent Saint Teresa of Jesus founded for centuries, you are joining a chain of prayer that spans entire generations of Carmelites who have prayed for the souls in purgatory with the same devotion you feel right now. Every Salve Regina you pray during the novena adds your voice to that immense chorus, and the force of that chorus reaches purgatory multiplied. The second step is to request a Mass for your cremated departed loved one on July 16th. This is critically important, and many Catholics underestimate it, sometimes because they don't know any better, sometimes because they can't imagine how much a single Mass offered at the right moment can change. The Mass is the most powerful act of worship that exists in the Church. When a priest offers the holy sacrifice for the soul of someone who has died, the blood of Christ is applied directly to that soul to relieve their purification. And if that Mass is celebrated on July 16th, the feast of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, the grace of the Mass combines with the special grace of the Marian feast. Those 2 currents of grace unite and act on the soul with a power that would be lesser on any other day of the year. Go to your parish this week. Speak with the priest. Ask for a Mass to be celebrated for the soul of your departed loved one on July 16th. If your parish already has all its Mass intentions filled for that day, look for another church. Look for a nearby Carmelite convent, because the Carmelites celebrate July 16th as their principal feast, and they often accept Mass intentions for that day with particular devotion. If there's no Carmelite convent you can reach, any parish will do. What matters is that the Mass is offered on that day for your departed loved one, with their name, with your clear intention. The third step is to offer a communion on that day for your cremated departed loved one. On July 16th, when you receive the Eucharist, offer that entire communion for the soul of your loved one. Before you approach the altar, say in your heart, "Lord, I offer this communion for the soul of my departed loved one, so that Our Lady of Mount Carmel may cover them with her mantle and free them from purgatory." That communion, offered with that intention, carries enormous spiritual weight. Saint Teresa of Jesus taught her nuns that communion offered for the dead was one of the most effective weapons against purgatory, because at that moment Christ Himself is inside you, and your petition goes out directly from His real presence within your body. The fourth step is a personal act of sacrifice, and this is the step fewest people take, but the one that carries the most force. On July 16th, choose a concrete sacrifice and offer it for your departed loved one. It could be a fast. It could be giving up something you enjoy for the day. It could be bearing some annoyance with patience, something that would normally get under your skin. What matters is that it's real, that it costs you something, and that you offer it consciously. Saint Teresa of Avila said that prayer without sacrifice is like a letter without a signature. The signature gives it authority. The sacrifice gives your prayer its weight. The fifth step takes place on the night of July 16th. Before you go to sleep, pray a complete rosary dedicated to your cremated departed loved one. All 5 mysteries. Every Hail Mary with the name of your loved one held in your heart. And when you finish, say out loud the prayer that closes the novena of Mount Carmel. Our Lady of Mount Carmel, my Mother and my Queen, you who promise to free from purgatory those who wear your holy scapular, I beg you to descend today on your feast and free the soul of the one I love. Cover them with your mantle. Take them with you. Those 5 steps are your part of the promise. Mary will do hers. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine a place where light exists but doesn't fully shine. a place where heat comes from within, like a fever that purifies the bones. That place smells of damp stone and something like incense burned a long time ago, a residue of ancient prayer floating in the air without fading. The sounds are distant, muffled, like bells ringing behind a mountain. And in the middle of that space, a space with no visible walls and no solid ground, there are souls, thousands of souls, waiting. Your cremated departed loved one may be there. What Saint Teresa of Jesus understood about purgatory came from direct experience. She didn't talk about purgatory the way someone recites a catechism lesson. She spoke as someone who had seen. In chapter 38 of the book of her life, she describes visions of purgatory in sensory language that makes your skin crawl. Souls surrounded by fire, yes, but a fire that cleanses rather than destroys. A fire that burns away what the soul accumulated in life, what keeps it from seeing God face to face. The difference between that purifying fire and the fire of cremation is vast. One operates on the soul, the other operated on the body. One is directed by God. The other was lit by the hands of a technician in a crematorium. And here is the point that changes everything for families with cremated departed loved ones. When Our Lady of Mount Carmel descends into purgatory on July 16th, what she brings with her has the power to extinguish that purifying fire in an instant. Mary arrives carrying a grace so powerful that the purification a soul needed can be completed in a single moment. Like when you pull open the curtains of a dark room and the light floods in all at once. No permission asked, no gradual steps. That is how Mary's grace acts on her feast day. That grace reaches every soul that belongs to her, whether their body lies under the earth or their ashes rest in an urn. Saint Teresa of Jesus described Mary's intercession with images rooted in the body, in what you can touch and feel. In The Way of Perfection, when she speaks of the Blessed Virgin's protection over her Carmelites, she uses the image of a mantle, a large, wide mantle that covers all her daughters at once. That mantle is warm. Whoever is underneath it feels its weight and its warmth, like the blanket your mother tucked around you when you were little and running a fever. The protection of Mary feels like that for the souls in purgatory, like a cover that arrives when the cold of purification seems unbearable. Now picture what happens when that mantle descends over a cremated soul on July 16th. The soul is in purgatory, exposed to the purifying fire, feeling the intensity of a pain that goes beyond anything the human body ever experienced in life. That pain is the worst suffering that exists, according to every mystic who has written about purgatory, from the fathers of the Church to the saints who received direct visions of that place. Worse than any physical pain you can remember. Worse than the longest illness, worse than the deepest loneliness, worse than death itself, because it is the pain of being close to God without being able to see Him yet, like standing behind a locked door, knowing that on the other side is everything you ever searched for. And then Mary comes. Her mantle descends. It touches the soul. And in that touch, the door opens. The purification is complete. The soul sees God. Does it matter that the soul was cremated? Mary finds it just the same. Because a cremated soul and a buried soul are in the same purgatory. They occupy the same spiritual space. They undergo the same purification. The difference lies in the body they left behind, and the body they left behind already served its purpose. In purgatory, what matters is the state of the soul, and the state of the soul depends on how the person lived, how they died, whether they were in God's grace, and whether someone on earth is praying for them. Saint Teresa of Avila had a way of praying for the dead that involved her whole body. She would kneel on the cold stone floor of her cell, squeeze her hands together until her knuckles went white, and pray with her eyes shut tight and her lips moving fast, as if every second counted. because for her, every second counted. Every Hail Mary that left her lips was a drop of water falling on the fire of purgatory. And when those drops gathered, they became a river strong enough to put out the fiercest blaze. That same urgency is what you need to feel right now, with July 16th so close. Your cremated departed loved one may be in purgatory at this very moment, feeling that pain the mystics describe as unbearable, waiting for someone on earth to do something, waiting for you to do something. And the feast of Our Lady of Mount Carmel is approaching like a door that will swing open for a few hours and then close again. What you do before and during that feast can be the difference between another year of purification for your loved one or their final liberation. But there are conditions, 5 specific conditions that activate the Carmelite promise for a cremated soul on July 16th. You already know the devotional protocol, the steps you need to take. Now you need to know the conditions that make those steps work. Because Mary's promise has requirements, and without those requirements, even the most fervent novena and the most devout Mass come up short. The conditions are 5. And the last one is the one most families don't know about, and the one that carries the most weight in the eyes of Our Lady of Mount Carmel. The first condition is that your cremated departed loved one received the investiture of the Scapular of Mount Carmel during their lifetime. This means that a priest, at some point before their death, placed the scapular on their shoulders with the official prayer of investiture. The investiture of the scapular is a liturgical act that consecrates the faithful person to Our Lady of Mount Carmel and spiritually enrolls them under her protection. That consecration is engraved on the soul. It endures after death. It endures after cremation. If your loved one received the scapular from a priest at any point in their life, the first condition is fulfilled. Now, Harim, what if you're not sure whether your departed loved one ever received the scapular? Many Catholics of earlier generations received it without making a big deal of it, as part of catechesis or some parish celebration. Ask older family members. Look through old photos where your loved one might be wearing the scapular around their neck. Check whether they belong to any confraternity of Our Lady of Mount Carmel. And if you discover that your departed loved one never received the scapula, don't lose hope. There is something you can do from right where you are now, and I'll explain it when we get to the 5th condition. The door is not closed to anyone who has faith. The second condition is that your departed loved one died in a state of grace or with sincere repentance. This means that before death, their soul was free from mortal sin, either because they went to confession in the days or weeks before their death, because they received the anointing of the sick with proper dispositions, or because in the final moment of their life, they made an act of perfect contrition before God. The Church teaches that God, in His infinite mercy, offers every soul the chance to repent even in the very last instant of life, even when there are no words left, even when the body no longer responds. A sigh of the heart can be enough. You cannot know with absolute certainty what happened in the heart of your departed loved one in that final moment, but God knows, and Mary knows. This condition, then, does not depend on you. It depends on God and on the interior disposition of your loved one in their last breath. And that is a reason for hope, because God wants to save. The third condition is that the cremation was not chosen for reasons contrary to the Catholic faith. If your departed loved one was cremated for practical reasons, financial reasons, out of respect for their wishes expressed during life, or for any reason that does not involve denying the resurrection of the body, or showing contempt for the body as God's creation, then the condition is met. The Church allows cremation with that single caveat, that it not be done as a gesture of rejecting the faith. And in the vast majority of cases, Catholic families who choose cremation do so for perfectly legitimate reasons. The fourth condition is that the ashes are preserved in a sacred place. The instruction ad resurgendum cum Christo published by the Church in 2016, clearly states that the ashes of the deceased must rest in a Catholic cemetery, a blessed columbarium, or a sacred place approved by the ecclesiastical authority. Keeping them at home, dividing them among family members, or scattering them in nature goes against the norm. If your loved one's ashes are at home or were scattered, there are steps you can take to remedy this situation. The most important being to bring the ashes to a sacred place as soon as possible. A priest can guide you. This condition matters because the Church understands that the body, even reduced to ashes, deserves a dignified place of rest where the faithful can visit and pray for the soul of the deceased. And now we come to the fifth condition, the most important one, the one many families don't know about, and the one that can change the situation of a cremated departed loved one who may never have received the scapular in life. The fifth condition is you, your prayer, your intercession, your Carmelite devotion offered for the soul of your departed loved one. The Carmelite tradition teaches that the living can intercede for the dead before Our Lady of Mount Carmel with an effectiveness that few sacramentals can equal. If your departed loved one did not receive the scapular in life, you can receive the scapular now and offer every grace you receive for them. You can pray the novena of Mount Carmel for them. You can offer masses, communions, and sacrifices in their name. You can stand before Mary with the scapular on your chest and say, "Mother, this departed loved one belongs to me, and I belong to you." Cover them with the same mantle that covers me. Saint Teresa of Jesus understood this kind of intercession like few saints ever have. She didn't just pray for her dead in a routine way. She took on the spiritual responsibility for them with an intensity that left the nuns who joined her vigils exhausted. When a benefactor of her convents died, Saint Teresa of Avila mobilized all of her nuns to pray for that soul, as if the person were a blood relative. She offered masses, fasting, penances, long nights of sustained prayer. She kept it up for weeks, sometimes months. And she did it with a total, unshakable conviction that her prayer was reaching purgatory with the force Mary granted her as a Carmelite consecrated under the mantle of Our Lady of Mount Carmel. You have that same capacity, even if you're not a nun and you don't live in a convent. Your scapular, your prayer, your sacrifice offered on July 16th for your cremated departed loved one, that completes what's missing. That closes the circle. That tells Mary this soul has someone on earth who is fighting for it with everything they have. And Mary answers that fight. She always has. She always does. Think about your cremated departed loved one right now. Think about their face, their voice, the last time you saw them alive, what you said to them, or what you never got the chance to say. Think about the moment you learned they had died and that icy void that opened in your chest like a hole that no embrace could close. Now think about where their soul is at this moment. If they died in God's grace, if their heart repented before the last breath left their body, then their soul is alive. It is conscious. It is somewhere that escapes maps and clocks, but that the Catholic faith recognizes as real. Your departed loved one knows who you are. They see you pray when you kneel beside your bed at night. They see you cry when you look at their photo in the living room. They hear you when you speak their name in prayer. They know you miss them with a pain that won't let up. And from where they are, from that purgatory, where the purifying fire burns away the impurities that keep them from seeing God face to face, they are asking you something. They ask it in silence because the souls in purgatory cannot ask with a human voice. They cannot cry out your name even if they wanted to. They ask it with an intensity that passes through the walls between the world of the living and the world of those who wait. They are asking you to do something for them this July 16th. July 16th of this year falls on a Wednesday. Mark that date on your calendar. Mark it right now before life distracts you and it slips past. because on that Wednesday, Our Lady of Mount Carmel is going to act in purgatory with a force that stays contained the rest of the year. And your cremated departed loved one needs you to be ready for that moment. You already know the 5 steps of the devotional protocol. You already know the 5 conditions that activate the promise. Now you need something more. You need to understand what can happen if you follow through on all of it. What could take place on July 16th with the soul of your loved one? Saint Teresa of Jesus described in her writings moments when she saw souls leave purgatory. She did it with a tremor in her pen that you can feel when you read her, as if the experience were too great for words. She described those liberations in language that blends the purest joy with the deepest relief. The emotion of someone who sees with their own eyes what others only believe by faith. She told how she watched the soul rise, surrounded by a light that grew brighter as the soul climbed higher, with an expression of peace as that wiped away in an instant all the suffering built up during the purification. And on several occasions, Saint Teresa of Jesus identified the intercession of Our Lady of Mount Carmel as the direct cause of that liberation. Mary appeared in her visions, stretching her mantle over the soul, covering it, shielding it, and then carrying it upward toward the presence of God, like a mother who picks up her sleeping child and carries them in her arms to bed. That is what can happen with your cremated departed loved one this July 16th. Mary can descend to the place where their soul waits. She can stretch her mantle over it. She can cover with her protection every corner of that soul that the purifying fire is still cleansing, and she can carry it into heaven in an instant on that Wednesday. Cremation changes none of this. The fire of the crematorium did what it did to the body months or years ago. But the soul of your departed loved one remains whole, remains alive, remains waiting. And the promise of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, the promise she made to Simon Stock in 1251, the promise Saint Teresa of Jesus lived from inside Carmel and passed on to every nun who wore the habit of her reform. That promise remains active for your loved one, because Mary looks at the soul, and the soul of your departed loved one wears a scapular that human fire never saw and that no crematorium can touch. Now I'm asking you something, and I want you to answer with your heart, not your head. Are you willing to do what's needed before July 16th? Are you willing to start the novena on July 7th, to request the Mass, to offer the communion, to make a real sacrifice, to pray the rosary that night with the name of your departed loved one in every Hail Mary? Because if you are, then Mary's promise has everything it needs to be fulfilled. Your part and hers, your prayer and her mantle, your sacrifice and her maternal power. Saint Teresa of Avila lived her entire religious life with that certainty. The certainty that Our Lady of Mount Carmel keeps her promises. The certainty that her mantle reaches where the human eye cannot see. The certainty that Mary goes down into purgatory and brings out her own. And you are one of her own if you wear her scapular. Your departed loved one is one of her own if you intercede for them with the strength the Carmelite tradition gives you. July 16th is almost here. Only days away. Your cremated departed loved one needs those days to count. Every prayer needs to count. Every sacrifice needs to count. So that when that Wednesday comes and Mary descends into purgatory with her mantle wide open, she finds the soul of your loved one ready to be gathered up. And she finds it ready because you did your part. Because you didn't let this date pass the way you let any other day pass on the calendar. Because you understood that July 16th, for souls consecrated to Our Lady of Mount Carmel, is the most important day of the year. And you chose to be there, with your prayer, with your sacrifice, with your faith, waiting for Mary to do what she promised. You made it to this point, and that means something. It means the soul of your cremated departed loved one has someone fighting for it. Someone who refused to settle for doubt, who didn't let the question keep floating through the silence of sleepless nights, who searched for the truth with an open heart and found it where it always was. In the promise of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, in the Carmelite tradition, Saint Teresa of Jesus, reformed and protected with her entire life, and in the Catholic faith that teaches us Mary's love has no borders that human hands can draw. Now you know that the promise of Our Lady of Mount Carmel reaches your cremated, departed loved one. You know the scapular left a mark on the soul that the crematorium fire never touched and that no furnace can erase. You know that mark remains intact in purgatory, shining like a jewel inside a destroyed chest, waiting for Mary to recognize it. You know July 16th is the date when Mary descends into purgatory with special power to free the souls that belong to her, the souls that carry her invisible seal, the souls that have someone on earth praying for them. You know the 5 steps you can take before and during that feast to work alongside Our Lady of Mount Carmel in liberating your loved one. And you know the 5 conditions that activate the promise, including the 5th, the most important one, you yourself, your prayer, your intercession. All of that is yours now. All of that is part of you from this moment forward, and no one can take it from you. But I want you to understand one more thing before we part. What you received here carries a spiritual weight that goes beyond information. Because knowing is one thing, and acting is something very different. And your departed loved one needs you to act. They need you to start preparing tomorrow for what you're going to do on July 16th. They need you to go to your parish and request that Mass. They need you to find a priest who can invest you with the scapular if you don't have one yet. They need you to mark July 7th on your calendar to begin the novena. They need every day between today and July 16th to be a day of prayer, sacrifice, and conscious offering for their soul. Saint Teresa of Jesus said that words without deeds are like cut flowers that wilt in a day. Beautiful to look at, but with no root to sustain them. What you received today are seeds, and seeds only bear fruit if you plant them in the soil of action. Your prayer is the soil, your sacrifice is the water, and the grace of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, which on July 16th pours down with a force that stays veiled the rest of the year, is the sunlight that will make everything you plant grow. Don't let another day go by without doing something concrete. Today, before this night is over, pray a Hail Mary for your cremated departed loved one and speak their name out loud before Our Lady of Mount Carmel. That small gesture, that first step, tells Mary you're willing to walk with her until July 16th. And Mary honors those who walk with her. She always has. If this message touched something inside you, if you felt that the words you just heard were placed in your path for a reason beyond coincidence, then you need to know there is more. Much more that the Carmelite tradition and the Catholic faith have been keeping for you, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. Because the spirituality of Saint Teresa of Jesus is a well that has no bottom. Every time you lower the bucket a little deeper, you bring up water that is cleaner, fresher, more able to quench the thirst you've been carrying inside since you lost the one you love. And that thirst is not quenched by a single conversation. It is quenched by a journey you started today, and one that has much more ahead. There are teachings from Saint Teresa of Avila about purgatory that you haven't heard yet. There are revelations about the intercession of the saints for the dead that can transform the way you pray every night before bed, the way you offer every Mass, the way you live every feast on the liturgical calendar. There are Carmelite prayers that have been freeing souls from the purifying fire for centuries. Prayers most Catholics have never learned because no one taught them, because they stayed locked behind the walls of convents where nuns pray them in silence before dawn. All of that is waiting for you. All of it has your name on it. And the best way to receive it is to stay here, to keep walking this spiritual path that today took a step your departed loved one will thank you for from the other side. Think about how many people in your family, your parish, your community, your prayer group are carrying the same question you were carrying before you heard this message. Think about how many mothers, fathers, sons, and daughters are asking themselves in silence whether the cremation of their loved one shut the door on the promise. Share this with them. Send them this message. Tell them to listen to the whole thing. Don't skip anything, because every word matters. Because for a Catholic family living with that anguish, what you just received can be the difference between despair and peace. And when you share this message, when you send it to that person you know needs it, you'll be doing more than sharing information. You'll be performing an act of spiritual charity. You'll be helping another soul in purgatory through another person who is going to pray, who is going to offer, who is going to activate the Carmelite promise for their own cremated departed loved one. And every soul that is freed from purgatory, thanks to a chain of prayer that started with you, is a triumph of Our Lady of Mount Carmel that has your name written on it. Saint Teresa of Jesus founded 17 convents during her lifetime, 17 places where nuns pray day and night for the souls in purgatory. Every convent was a battle against church bureaucracy, against bishops who distrusted her, against civil authorities who threw up obstacles, against her own sick body that begged for rest. And she answered it by walking more miles down muddy roads. Every foundation cost her health, money, friends, peace of mind. There were moments she thought everything was collapsing. There were nights she cried alone in an unfinished cell, with damp walls and the cold seeping into her bones. But she pressed on, because she knew every convent was one more door opening between heaven and purgatory. Every nun who prayed in those convents was one more voice asking Mary for the souls who waited. And every soul that left purgatory because of those prayers was living proof that all the suffering, all the exhaustion, the entire price she paid was worth it. Worth every tear. You can't found a convent. But you can do something with the same spiritual root, the same force in the eyes of God and Mary. You can pray, you can offer, you can sacrifice. You can love your departed loved one with a love that crosses the border between the living and the dead and reaches purgatory with the strength of someone who loves for real. You can stand before Our Lady of Mount Carmel on July 16th with your hands full of novena, of mass, of communion, of fasting, of rosary, and say, "Mother, here I am. I did everything I could. Now it's your turn." And Mary is going to answer, because that is what she does. That is what she has been doing since 1251, when she handed the scapular to Simon's stock and told him that whoever wore it would not suffer eternal fire. Mary keeps her promises. She keeps them for those with a body in the ground and for those who were reduced to ashes. She keeps them for those who wore the cloth scapular against their skin and for those who wear the invisible scapular, that consecration engraved in the deepest part of their soul. She keeps them because she is a mother. And a mother doesn't ask how her child died or what happened to the body afterward. A mother only asks where they are, and she goes to find them. May Our Lady of Mount Carmel cover you with her mantle tonight. May she cover you as you sleep, as you dream, as your heart keeps beating with the name of your departed loved one carved into every beat. May she cover your cremated departed loved one with that same protection she promised nearly 800 years ago. The protection Saint Teresa of Jesus knew from inside Carmel and that today reached you. May July 16th be the day for your family when all the anguish finally ended. The day the promise was fulfilled, the day Mary went down into purgatory and took your loved one to heaven. And may Saint Teresa of Jesus, the woman who reformed Carmel with broken hands and an unbroken faith, intercede him for you and for your departed loved one before the throne of God, today, tomorrow, and always. Amen.